Hello everybody, welcome to the afternoon sessions. This session is about integrity and misconduct. The same rules apply as this morning. So we're going to start with Daniele Fanelli, who's going to talk about his research, summary effect sizes in meta-analysis after removal of retracted studies from the pool of primary studies.
Hello, is this, yes? Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. And the title pretty much says it all. This is a study about retractions and their effects on meta-analysis. Now, I'm gonna guess that the audience at a conference like this needs no introduction about what retractions actually are. And I bet many of you will be also familiar with the, by now, rather substantive literature on the prevalence and the nature of retractions, on their effects on citations. Now, what I found, however, quite remarkable is that even though I think most people instinctively think that retractions or assume that retractions are a problem, there are, to my knowledge, very few studies that have actually tried to look at what kind of problem retractions actually are for the scientific community at large. A notable exception that I thought was worth mentioning is this study from a few years ago, which tried to assess the financial costs entailed by retracting papers. And in particular, they looked at NIH-funded studies over a period of 20 years. I think I'm thundering a little. And as you can see, their conclusion were that overall, the total costs were about 58 million, which amount to less than 1% of NIH's budget, and the average cost per retracted article was rather substantive, almost $400,000, but you can see with a huge standard deviation. And in other words, I mean, depending on how you want to look at this figure, you could say that it's a lot because it's, in a sense, avoidable costs, or not as much. But certainly, one of their conclusions is that this is not a disproportionate cost compared to how relatively infrequent retractions are. And I think even more interestingly, as again suggested by the figures themselves, it's a cost that varies very much on a case-by-case basis. And in a sense, what we want to look at here is the same problem, but from an epistemic, a scientific point of view. What costs the retractions entail in terms of the beliefs that we have about specific effects or knowledge that we assume we have. And so very quickly what we proceeded to do was the following. We identified in the Web of Science all articles recorded as retracted to date, the date being last year, and identified all records in the Web of Science that were citing those articles, so that from these we could boil the number down to a list of plausible, potentially usable meta-analyses. And then we limited this list to last year, to 2016, and so we had 109 potentially relevant articles, and these were retrieved for inspection and included or excluded based on these few, and I would say rather, as loose as possible criteria. The main criteria being that we needed meta-analysis, which amongst the pool of primary studies had a retracted study within them. And this selection, and particularly this factor alone, reduced the list quite a bit. We ended up with 15 meta-analyses. In the abstract, we actually say 17, but upon secondary inspection, 2 actually couldn't be included either. So we have 15 meta-analyses, whose values were all converted towards ratio and were coined, meaning that we reversed the values whenever necessary to ensure that the direction of the treatment effect was always the same. And then we did something very simple. We calculated the summary effect size for the meta-analysis as given, and then recalculated the value without the retracted study, and took a ratio of the two. So when the ratio value is 1, there is no difference. When the value of the ratio is above 1, that means that the retracted study was presumably falsely increasing our confidence or our belief in a certain effect, and vice versa, when the ratio is smaller than 1, it was actually decreasing it. And, well, with no further ado, these are the overall results. So what you see here is the ratio of odds ratio for all these studies. And these are listed, as you see, on the left column, not by the author of the meta-analysis or the title of the meta-analysis, but by the author of the retracted study that was included in them. The forest plot in the middle is not going to say much this way. I regret actually not having log transformed the scale, but you get the numbers on the right for this ratio of odds ratio. Now, two things to notice. First of all, that in two cases, again, the abstract says 3, but 1 was removed. We have the same paper being cited by 2 different meta-analyses, which already says something about the potential impact of a retraction, which is not just about 1, but potentially several studies. And the other, concerning the values, as you can see, is that overall, the values that we get are, first of all, for the majority above the value of 1, meaning that generally speaking, on average, removing the retracted study led to a decrease of the estimated effect sizes. But also, you might notice how in most cases, the values are actually very close to 1 anyway. They're very, very small, with a few exceptions. And so the overall pooled summary that you see at the bottom, so this is a meta-analysis of these values, assuming random effects, which sort of tries to give more of an equal weight to the different studies, but is very, very small. It's 1.02, so at best that would be a 2% higher value for a meta-analysis with the retracted study, and in any case, the confidence interval is, of course, very, very large. Now, how can we explain, in case for the people at the bottom, this is the overall figure of the pooled results. And so there are 2 observations that we can make about what can explain some of this variance in results. One, which is sort of predictable, is that the impact of removing a retracted study is higher for smaller meta-analysis. And so here you see, of course, the values of the ratios of odds ratio plotted against the size of the meta-analysis, the number of studies included. The other observation, and this is sort of an exploratory observation, but as I'll try to illustrate, I think it's quite interesting, is that there seem to be differences concerning what the retraction occurred for. Now, the caveat here is that this classification was based on the text of retraction notices, and as we probably all know quite well, these are not always reliable information, particularly when it comes to scientific misconduct, because there are understandable concerns on behalf of editors of making the case too explicit unless there is no risk of a legal consequences. Nonetheless, based on what the retraction notices declared, we have this whole group of retractions due to plagiarism or to other, I'm saying QRP, but really this is other ethical breaches of research practice that have nothing to do, apparently, with the data or the results. And with one possible exception, the values are all very, very close to 1. There are 2 studies that were retracted explicitly due to fabrication and falsification. Now, you might notice that the first author is the same, the case of misconduct was the same, but the articles are different. And in both these cases, actually, the values are quite extreme and above 1, meaning that essentially these articles were presumably overestimating and leading, therefore, the whole literature to overestimate the value of the result. But equally interestingly, I would argue, the retractions that were due to honest errors, seemingly, so errors that had to do with the methods or the data, but were sort of openly declared by the authors as being a mistake, are, at least in 2 cases, extreme in the opposite direction, meaning that these studies were actually bringing the overall summary originally down, and without them, the estimate goes up. And so, just to quickly summarize the study, again, we collected this, for now, small pool of meta-analysis and looked at whether removing the retracted paper made a difference. And the results are that, on average, across these studies, we cannot pick really a statistically significant direction of effects, because there is, again, quite a remarkable variability in what specifically happens. And on a preliminary or exploratory level, we can conclude something nonetheless about the fundamental question: what does a retraction make in terms of a difference? And it is probably on average very little, but that's because, quite similarly to the estimation of the financial costs, this is going to vary on a case-by-case basis. First of all, because smaller literatures are going to be more impacted by a retraction, but also because in the case of fabrication and falsification, we seem to observe, and it seems plausible to hypothesize, that the overall summary estimate might actually go down. So we might be misled in believing effects or treatments when in reality this is based on false and made-up data. But also, when there is a genuine error that is being rooted out, then the exact opposite is actually the case. And so, a retraction in that case, you could argue, improves our knowledge and our confidence in results. And, well, this is all I had. I'll thank Julie Wong, who helped us collect most of the data, and I'll thank you all for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Can I just ask a point of clarification? So, in this study, were the retractions already in place? What was the timing of the retractions compared to when these studies were included in the systematic reviews?
That's actually a good question. We didn't explicitly look at when the formal retraction was issued. There's no question that the retractions were recognized, and all these meta-analyses had been published last year. Presumably, that would entail that the retractions, that's actually what I was assuming, but you just made me think that maybe in some cases the authors had actually missed the fact that the study was retracted, and we'll look into that. Thanks.
Okay. Question there?
Ivan Aransky from Retraction Watch. That was my question. Thank you, Jigisha. It was one of my 2 questions. I guess the other was, I just want to make sure I got this, because I may have just been unclear, but the 15 was in the last year, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so these were just in the last year. So you weren't including anything like Joachim Bolt from several years ago, because.
So evidently not. That could have happened, again, presumably if the meta-analyst had missed the fact that these studies had been retracted. But the meta-analyses were published last year.
Okay, yeah, because that was a case where Njama republished the meta-analysis without, did exactly what you did here and sort of took it out, but that was a few years ago, so I just wanted to make sure I was clear. Thank you, very interesting.
Question there?
And Andreas Lund, Center of Evidence-Based Medicine in Denmark. It's a little bit similar to the question you asked before, because I think what you were asking was, here in 2016, what does it matter for those meta-analyses created now, where we know that the flawed papers were actually retracted. But I think an interesting question would be to look at the time window from when it was published until when it was retracted, and to see actually what did the data contribute to in a meta-analysis performed at that time, where we didn't know that the study was flawed. Because I think today, if you know a study was flawed, you would probably not include it in a meta-analysis, or at least if you do, you would judge it as high risk of bias. Whereas in retrospect, you might think that it could actually be a sound study, and therefore it could contribute to an invalid conclusion. I don't know if you get my question.
So if I get your question, you're saying a study that is flawed, but we don't know yet, might have an influence on the literature.
Yeah, because it could be that it was a big trial, and then you would conclude that no new trials are necessary. But since you know it's retracted, additional trials might have been done in order to kind of answer the questions.
So that would be another contribution of a retracted study or a retraction to the overall research process. Is that what you're...
Yeah, I think just the interesting question is, at the time the study was published, did it actually affect the literature? And what you are asking is, here in retrospect now, when we know it's retracted, does it really contribute to anything? And I think it's maybe not the clinic, from a clinical point of view, I would like to know whether I was fooled at that time.
Right, I mean, so yeah, I think it's an interesting point in a sense that that is also a possible contribution that even flawed or even fabricated studies might make. And again, another sort of controversial argument, if you like, comes to mind concerning scientific fraud even, the fact that sometimes the very fact that someone dared, purely because they believed something to be the case, to make up some data just to make the claim first, stimulated research in a way that paradoxically becomes positive. And I think the observation you're making does tap into a little bit of what the initial, again, preliminary moral kind of that can be drawn from a study like this is, which is that retractions can have varying effects. I think, and this is generally my position, and again, it's sort of somehow reinforced by these results. You know, I could be biased in this way, but this is increasingly how I see it, that we sort of stigmatize retractions as something that is essentially just a problem to be removed, and in the ideal world, retractions would never happen. Whereas in fact, the picture is more complex, and there are at least as many reasons to celebrate at least certain kinds of retractions as there are to stigmatize them.
Drummond Rennie, San Francisco. I know that this is not your message. Your message is that if you do meta-analyses, this is what happens. And I think I like this paper, and I hope you'll continue and continue and continue until you're as old as I am. It'll be interesting to see. I don't want anyone, perhaps no one is, getting the impression that this doesn't matter, which is a different thing. And it's not what you're saying. And that has been used as an excuse for not publicizing retractions at all. I think of one of, say, 70 or 80 that I've seen and had personal experience of, and before Ivan was born. For example, the big breast cancer study, where a Canadian center of the study effectively made up all the evidence. It was taken out of the study, but the journals were not told at all. Articles or manuscripts, including those centers, with known to be defective data, were still submitted to journals during that time. And it was only when the newspapers got hold of it that everything unraveled. At the same time, there are huge consequences on the researcher and everybody down the line, their colleagues. Institutions could be brought to a halt and nearly bankrupted by this sort of thing. It matters. That's not what you're saying, and congratulations on a nice start.
Great, thank you. And let me pick up on that a second, because I think this goes right at the core of the issue here, which I think that we should start always keeping in mind clear distinctions between types of retractions. There are retractions that are due to reasons that are really bad and that are demoralizing for the scientific enterprise and that in general will cause the kind of problems that you just illustrated. There is increasingly, in fact, a second form of retraction, which has to do with authors doing the right thing. And there is, I think, a growing understanding that this kind of behavior needs to be encouraged, and that although it might cause some problems for editors, surely, it is something that is vital to the research process, and it's something that, it might seem paradoxical, but needs to be rewarded and encouraged. And so that really is the core. I wouldn't disagree with you, but again, I think you're thinking of the bad ones, which have a bad consequence also for meta-analysis and the literature. But there is a whole universe of possible other flaws that somewhat are inevitable and that the correction of which should be honored.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I take it there are no more questions from Twitter or Facebook? Can't see. We'll move on, so thank you.
Thank you.